Is a Cummins swap worth it? Yes. And no. I built up a pretty cool 80 series over the past year, and I have since sold it, and I'm sitting here in front of a stock one. The reason being is I spent so much money on it that I ended up going into debt and I had to sell it. It does cost a lot of money to come and swap a Land Cruiser. You can check out the Come and Swap playlist on my channel and you can see the complete build from the time we got the truck, ripped the engine out, rebuilt it, and then ended up putting it in the truck and driving it. A Come and Swap, and particularly for the 80 series, is worth it if you have the money. I didn't have the money, and I've been driving Uber for the last 3 years for 60 hours a week in order to finance it, because I thought it was super cool. I wanted to start the channel out with something fun and informative for you guys. I'm not gonna go into if you make X amount of money per year, you can afford it. That's gonna be your own prerogative. If it is your daily driver, I would highly not recommend it because it's gonna be down for some time. It could be 2 weeks if you do it on the fast end, or it could be a year, who knows? There's a lot of little things you have to get right. If you want to turn heads, it's definitely a great swap because having a diesel engine in a Land Cruiser, at least in the United States, is very rare, and it looks pretty cool, it sounds cool. When you're at the gas station, you have awesome conversations with people who are like, you put a Cummins in that? And you're like, yeah. It came with an inline 6, 4.5 liter, so there's enough space. Basically, you're all stroke between the 1FZ that's in these 80 series Land Cruisers and the 12 valve Cummins. So there is enough room, but the front axle, people get worried about if it's going to be strong enough. I never had any issues. You can do some gussets on the front knuckles, the berths, and that could strengthen it a little bit, but I've never had any issue with the housing, and I was running 40-inch Nitto mud grapplers on steel bead locks. As long as you take it slow and you're careful off-road, then you can do it. It is a good candidate for a swap if your engine has failed. Maybe it's a blown head gasket. Maybe you threw a rod through the block. Maybe like my friend Matt, he had the 1HDT in his Land Cruiser, which is a diesel engine from Toyota, but it skipped timing and all the valves bent. So he was able to get a good price on his donor truck, and for him it made sense. But even on the low end, on the very lowest end, I don't think you can do it for less than around $7,000. And that's just the money, now you have to do it. How much time is it gonna take? How many parts are you gonna have to order when you get to this obstacle in the road and you have to figure out a solution? There is no one-size-fits-all kit for this swap. Now, Dustin's gonna get mad at me for saying that because he's the guy I bought my swap kit through. Again, there is a video on this complete swap kit on my channel. I'll link it down in the description. But there's still other things you have to do, like a radiator fan shroud. We never really figured that out, and I didn't have one, and the one I sold was having cooling issues. I don't know if it was because of that or because I gave it so much fuel and rolled coal everywhere that it was probably overheating a little bit. I'm not exactly certain on the onboard diagnostics of 91 through 94, talking specifically about Land Cruisers, but you are gonna run into some obstacles as well as when you have to take out your computer and figuring out where your sensors go and all that kind of stuff. My friend Mitchell Stencil built his for, again, around $7,000 to $8,000. Now, that's the cost of everything, and he has extensive fabrication knowledge and skill. He was able to in-house a lot of that because he has the experience in order to do something like that. Having that experience is key if you want to do this at a low cost. This is a huge issue. I didn't have the space to do it. I was renting a house, and it was kind of a nightmare trying to do all that. Luckily, Matt lended me his driveway, so we were able to do most of the swap in his driveway, taking the old gas engine out and putting the Cummins in, but even that took a couple months. So you need to have a space to do it, which is probably why most people just pay people to do these. But then when you do that, you're in the $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 range, maybe more, depending on what you want. It requires a lot of patience. It's so easy, and I'm guilty of it. I went through some shortcuts where I probably should have got A part and I got B because I was impatient and I headed to the parts store. It's paramount that you are very patient with the swap and that you do everything right so you don't have leaks, you don't have timing issues if you rebuild the engine. One thing that people speculate a lot about Cummins swaps is the extra weight. Now, these come with a 1FZ engine, which is a cast iron block aluminum head, and it weighs around, I would say, 700 pounds maybe. The Cummins is gonna weigh around 1,000 pounds, so it's a significant amount more. Now, most people have cantilevered bumpers and winches out front of their Land Cruisers. I feel like that weight could be potentially more because of how it's levered than the Cummins being centered right over the axle. Again, you can trust the front axle housing if you're worried about it, but having ran 40s for a year with it, I didn't have any issues. As long as you're safe with it and don't bounce your front end up and then shock load it and break an axle or bend your axle housing and or berths. One thing to consider is your spring rate. for whatever vehicle you're putting it into before you do the swap. If you're going to get that kind of stink bug or Carolina squat, you don't want that. And that the Cummins is going to contribute to that depending on your spring setup. So I ended up going with 6-inch springs in the front and 4-inch in the rear to compensate and make it leveled out. It ended up being around the perfect height, but I had to fine tune it, and I went through all sorts of different springs, spring rates, and it's kind of a nightmare. You want to get it right the first time. Tire size is a huge pro for the Cummins because diesel has a lot more torque inertly than gas does, depending on the application, right? Just talking about base engines coming from the factory. I had 40-inch tires on my white Land Cruiser, and it felt like they were 33s because there was so much torque. Now I did tune it a little bit and I got it extra fuel, stock HX35 turbo, so stock boost. I think I was only getting around 14 to 20 at its peak. But tire size is an awesome thing to consider if you're going to bigger tire sizes. 37s would be awesome for a Cummins swap. 40s, you could probably go up to 44, but then you have to cut fenders and do all this crazy stuff. Another question is, are you okay driving a manual? The main transmission that people do for this swap is the NV4500 5-speed out of the Dodge. I was lucky, and when I picked up my donor truck, it was a 2-wheel drive, but I didn't care about the transfer. I didn't care about a transfer case because I just wanted the NV4500 and I wanted the Cummins, and I got mine for around 3,000. I got lucky. However, it did have 450,000 miles on it, so I thought it was a good candidate for a rebuild, being that I got the truck for such a low price to start with. There are kits and torque converters and flex plates that people make or can have fabricated to keep the stock A443 transmission that comes in the Land Cruiser, but now you have to go through tuning. I think it's called Mega Squirt or some sort of tuning software that you can do on your computer so that you can get your shift points correctly. Something to consider as well if you're going to dive into this swap is, what is the condition of the donor vehicle? Let's talk about the initial 12-valve Cummins with the VE pump and the P pump. These trucks are 30 years old. They're going to have issues with them, but generally not the motor, which is why you usually see a lot of Dodge Rams rusted out, falling apart, bad steering around the engine because it's made of cast iron, it's extremely stout, and mine still had cross-hatching in the cylinder walls when I went to rebuild it. How is your front axle? How is the steering components? There's a lot more complexity to the front axle than there is compared to the rear axle, at least in my opinion, with what you're going to have to work on. Do you have any demons as far as your bursts, as far as your seals leaking? Do you have enough fluid in your diff? You know, these are things to think about before you just go and throw an engine with a lot more torque, not necessarily horsepower, into your vehicle. The last thing you want is to spend all this money and then end up on the side of the road or flipped over because you had a bad steering linkage and you lost your ability to steer and you sent your front end through a tree and bent things. That's not what you want. A huge pro to swapping, at least in a Land Cruiser or any vehicle with 410s in the diffs, is I think that's the perfect ratio if you're going to go with 35-inch tires or above. I had 40s and 410s were perfect. You could argue that if you went to 488s that you would have a little bit higher revving, but diesels don't want that anyways. I could top out at around 85, 90 at around 3,000 RPM on the highway with 40s, and I think that's pretty good. So that's a plus, is that you don't have to mess with your ring and pinion. You get to keep your 410 gears, which are known for being very strong compared to a 529. A lot of people ask about what type of mileage do you get when you do a Cummins swap. Just like Jonesy said, you don't do this swap for the mileage necessarily. Over time, you will eventually make up what you spent on the swap with getting a little bit better mileage from the diesel, but honestly, the difference is negligible. Yes, you get better mileage with bigger tires, but diesel is more expensive now anyways, which is completely arbitrary if you ask me. I think diesel should be cheap, but that's a whole nother issue. I was getting around 17 miles a gallon with 40-inch tires in a 6,000-pound rig. I even got 17 miles a gallon when I was towing my Corolla when I moved to Las Vegas. It was a 1,000-mile trip and I was getting 17 miles a gallon. That's good. Another thing is, are you going to be towing a lot? Now, the Land Cruiser is relatively short compared to a full-size truck, so legally, you're going to have to look at your payload and all this stuff if you're thinking about towing excessive amounts with it. Something to think about if you do this swap is the 8-inch or 8.5-inch ring and pinion that comes with the Land Cruiser. Is people say it can be weak. I think the weak points are the bursts tending to get bent from hard off-roading and or the inner axles. It's a small ring and pinion, so you could develop issues down the road. Something that a few people have done is swap a Dana 60 from a Ford. You'd have to relocate your diff housing and figure out tubing and all that. Something I was thinking about doing. We are going to be building another one. I'm not sure if we're going to do an OM606 swap or we're going to do another 12 valve, but we're probably going to do another swap at this red one behind me. Something people don't think about as well is like, okay, your engine's in. Now you need an exhaust. I use the stock flange off of the Dodge, but I had to fabricate my own exhaust, and I made a hood stack because I thought it was cool It honestly is pretty cool if you ask me. A lot of people gave me hate for that, but now you have to fabricate an exhaust. Matt had an exhaust made. He also had his intercooler piping made if you don't go with the kit. These are extra costs you have to consider if you don't want smoke all over your engine bay. Also, if you don't want to get carbon monoxide poisoning. With the kit that I bought, I had all working gauges, but that's really not that expensive to do. You can also get the decoded digital. It's some sort of thing that takes a signal from your alternator and sends it to your dash, but there's some conversion you have to do there as well. So you have to be prepared for things like that. Another thing you have to think about, do I want working gauges? Again, on the low side, you could potentially, if you do everything yourself and source your swap parts and the engine, let's say you already had one, I still think you're in the $7,000 minimum range. I spent $15,000 on mine. There's a link in the description of this video for how much it cost me to do my swap for my Land Cruiser, so you can click on that if you want to see the full details of my swap from start to finish. Overall, it's definitely a male justification to say, oh, well, my engine's bad and I'll get better mileage with the diesel if I swap the diesel in and do this swap. And I'm kind of guilty with that. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the engine that I had in there. I just thought it would be cool for the channel, and I think you guys do too, to see a Cummins go into a Land Cruiser. But the justification for doing this swap is not financial. It's to have those gas station conversations and to just have the cool factor, the wow factor. It's super cool to hear it rolling up to a gas station or out on the trail idling, just hearing that kind of rock, 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 rock. It's super cool. But if you don't have the money, or if you're not even in the ballpark of that money, you have to consider these things, that it could be down for some amount of time. It's a great swap, and I would highly recommend that people look into it if they're thinking about doing a conversion or their engine's about to fail and they know it, but it's going to be something that you're going to need to take your time with or outsource to somebody else completely. I hope I answered all of your guys' questions regarding if it's worth it to swap a Cummins turbo diesel into a Land Cruiser or any other application for that matter. As always, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below and I'll be sure to get back to them. I answer all of your guys' comments, and I appreciate you viewing the channel. If you gained anything out of this video or you found it useful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps out the channel and allows me to do these projects and continue to go on. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to click the links down in the description below if you want to see more about this Cummins swap, total cost, and the rest of the build.